Hey, North Coast Church. Great to be with your growth groups again as we go through Philippians. Today, we're looking at Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 to 30 in your groups. A great passage where there is so much packed in about relationships between different Christians and how God's people are to live their lives with other Christians being examples to them. And that's where I want to start. Think back in your life to those Christians who were great examples to you over the years. It could be a short period of time they were with you. It could be over a long period of time. But think about those Christians that most shaped your Christian life in a positive way. And perhaps at the end of the session, you might want to pray for them and thank God for them. But it's important to remember that we are in a network of relationships together as Christians. And God brings people into our lives who will help us grow as Christians. And in this session today, I want to look at how Paul unpacks the lives of other people in the lives of God's people in Philippi. And we are looking at this series, Joy. And one thing Paul finds is great joy in other people who are Christians, great joy in other people who are Christians. And notice how he starts with this passage, "Therefore, my beloved." And it's very easy, I think, to overlook that and not even notice that's there. And it's also, it's like just a few words there. But there's something deep about that. Paul loves the Philippians. He calls them my beloved. And there's something deep and rich about the relationships that Christians started to form with each other because of who Jesus was and what Jesus had done. And Paul says about these Philippians, "Therefore, my beloved." Now, Paul's away from them. He's in prison and they're in Philippi, and he wants them to live godly lives, whether he's there or whether he's not. And it's very interesting what he goes on to say next. "Therefore, my beloved, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Paul isn't upset, or Paul is upset that he's not with them. He'd love to be with them, but he's not worried for their salvation. He calls them to work out their own salvation with fear and trembling, so with sobriety and a sober-minded attitude. Not because they have to do it all by themselves, because he's not there, but because God is there with them. It is God who works in you. Work out your own salvation, for it is God who works in you. He doesn't say work out your own salvation or God will work it out. He says, as you work out your salvation, it is proof that God is working in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Even the very will we have to live a godly life, says Paul, comes from God. It's absolutely incredible to read that. You do the work as God does the work. And what Paul would go on to do is explain a little bit about what that work looks like. And then he's going to talk about a couple of blokes, Timothy and Paphroditus, who live the kind of lives that Paul wants the Philippians to emulate. And he wants them to emulate that form of life because that's how Jesus lived his own life, and they are following his example. So where Paul goes next, he says, "Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent." Verse 14, "that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent." It's interesting, isn't it, that I think Christians think that the primary way that the world will notice that we're blameless and innocent, or the primary way that we are to be blameless and innocent, is to avoid certain things, and we've got a list of them. But imagine if it were that our grumbling or disputing among us was the key to how we were doing as Christians, as a group. It was the key to whether we were shining like lights in the world. Would we be judged by Paul as having failed this if he looked at us as a church, that we are doing things without grumbling or disputing? Those little things get in and they can actually ruin things, can't they? That grumbling and disputing. And Paul says that's actually integral to what it means to be blameless and innocent, to not grumble and not dispute among yourselves. Big issue there. Paul then goes on to say that there's a whole bunch of people I want to send to you to show you, to show you how to keep living this life. It's deeply relational. This is what he says. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. That's verse 19. You see, in Timothy, Paul has someone who models what it looks like to be a Christian, servant-hearted leader, someone who you would look up to later in your Christian life and say, that person helped me through these things. And Paul wants to be cheered by news of them. There's that relational thing going on again. But look what he says about Timothy. I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. Now, I mentioned this passage on Sunday in my sermon, and I mentioned that verse, for I have no one like him, like Timothy, who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. But I didn't add the next bit. Look what Paul says next. For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. There's something sad about that, isn't there? That Paul says there's no one like Timothy in the church. Already, people are already serving their own interests, but Timothy is genuine in that he cares for you. One of the things I think is that we like to imagine there was a golden era of the church back in the day when everyone was concerned for everyone else's welfare. Yet, he says, no one but Timothy. No one but Timothy. This is the person to emulate. This is the person who's going to help you. And he's going to cheer me up by bringing news of you. He goes on to say, but you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father, he has served with me in the gospel. Do you see a couple of things about Timothy? He's genuine towards the Philippians and he's humble. In those days, a father would hand his son on a trade on to his son. So his son would watch the father and watch how he did life and work, and he would model that to his son, and the son would take on that same trade. That's how it worked. If your dad was a farmer, you were a farmer. If your dad was a carpenter, you were a carpenter, and you learned it from him. And Paul says exactly the same thing about Timothy. Timothy has watched my life, says Paul, and as a son with a father, he's serving with me in the gospel. Paul's not asking Timothy to do anything that he hasn't done before. And that's why Paul can trust to send Timothy. I hope, therefore, to send him, says Paul, because he knows that just as Paul has lived the gospel life for the sake of the Philippians, so too with Timothy. He's genuine and he cares for people. And it's obvious because other people don't. That's a huge issue, isn't it? It really is, that Timothy was there helping and other people, not just himself. The next thing that goes on to say is there's someone else there. It's not just Timothy. There's another bloke. He's called Paphroditus. I have thought it necessary to send to you Paphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. Now, we talked about Paphroditus on Sunday as well, and Paphroditus was from Philippi, had gone to see Paul in prison and bring him some supplies, and then would be going back to the Philippian church. And look how Paul describes him, my brother, a fellow worker, fellow soldier. That's all the stuff we talked about last week about partnership. But he's also your messenger and minister to my need. The Philippians weren't able to get to Paul, so they still cared for him by sending Paphroditus. Very interesting how that goes on. And what ends up happening is that Paphroditus gets to see Paul and then falls ill. And Paul goes on to say this, indeed he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him. And Epaphroditus' big problem in verse 26 was that he had been longing for the Philippians, it says, and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. We mentioned this on Sunday last week, that Epaphroditus was ill, and his distress wasn't because he was ill. His distress was because they had heard he was ill. He was so concerned for the Christians in Philippi and his brothers and sisters there that the very fact of his illness just cut him to the heart, because they would feel terrible if they thought something was going wrong with him and that he was ill near to death. And Paul goes on to say, but God had mercy on him, verse 27, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. It's a deep, thick relationship that Paul has with these fellow workers in the gospel. In verse 29, Paul wants to send Paphroditus back, and he uses these words. He says in verse 29, so receive him in the Lord and with all joy, and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. It's very interesting that Paul says the kind of men you're supposed to honor aren't the flashy types, aren't the people who are healthy, wealthy, and wise all the time, but it's these kind of people who would risk their life for the sake of the gospel and bring service to other people. And that's exactly what Paphroditus did. And Paul says, those are the type of people you're supposed to honor. The culture we live in doesn't honor those type of people. And it's very easy for us in the church not to honor those types of people. But Paul here says, those are the people you're supposed to honor. So as you go through the passage again, what you realize is that there's a deep relational sense that Paul has with the Philippians. He can't be there. He knows God's in control, so he commits them to God, knowing that God can keep them in their salvation. He wants them to live such godly lives that without grumbling or disputing, that people will realize that there's something different about these folk. But he also has these two great characters, Timothy and Paphroditus. And what makes them great is not they've got amazing gifts or impressive in any way, but they're genuinely concerned for the welfare of God's people, and they put their lives on the line for the sake of serving others. It's an upside down world. The Roman world of Paul's day would not have operated like that. Indeed, the world of the 21st century doesn't operate like that. But can you imagine being churched together where people who are in leadership serve that way? That's what church leadership is supposed to look like. That's what Christian leadership is demanded to be by the scriptures. And that's what we want to be as we lead our groups and as we lead our families as Christians, in whatever setting we're in, that we would have genuine concern for others and that would be godly and we'd be servant-hearted in all we do. Now, that's the end of chapter 2. I'm going to put some questions through to your growth group leaders, and you're going to go through those together. But it'd be really good to take some time to stop and pray and thank God for those leaders in your life, those Christians over the years who have helped you become more like Jesus. And also to pray that you would be the kind of person that others would look to and say, they're the kind of people that help me get through these things. They're the kind of people that encourage me to be more like Jesus. So it's great to spend this time with you. And my prayer is that together we would have deep joy in the gospel, deep joy because of what God has done in us and through us for the sake of others.